Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first episode of the new Evergreen podcast, Cultivate. So Cultivate is something that I was dreaming up, this idea of how could we bring all of our Evergreen family together to talk about innovation in ministry, what is working, what isn't working, how do we process what God is doing in our ministries and our own individual lives. But I didn't want to just stop there. I also wanted us to get a pulse of how is God moving in the region. So a lot of what's going to be happening in these episodes, we're going to have different guests, different subjects, talking about things that we feel are relevant to what Evergreen is all about. So it's an uncharted journey, and we're looking forward to where it's going to take us, and we hope you're here for the ride. So please subscribe to this, tell others about it. We're going to talk a lot about what Evergreen is about, and we think you're really going to enjoy it. So I thought it would be very fitting for our first episode to interview our executive minister, Reverend Douglas Avilesbernal. This is kind of fun for me, Doug, because I remember I did a podcast for Japanese Baptist Church, and that's the church that we're in right now in their legacy space, with these beautiful pictures of their history all around us. One of my first guests in my podcast when I was a pastor at Japanese Baptist Church was doing the interview with you. Mm-hmm. And I thought that would be a great way to just start off what we're doing with this podcast. Yeah. So maybe for those who don't know you, when they're listening to this podcast for the first time or they found us online, maybe if you could tell us a bit about yourself, just your background and how you came to be the executive minister of Evergreen.
Well, my upbringing was very diverse. My parents are each from a different country, and they were working in different countries at times. So it was a missionary upbringing. And so I've grown with diversity all my life. And that's been a really good thing to live out into, especially in the space we're in now. And then I went to seminary, and by coincidence, the Spirit, I found myself being called to a church that was aspiring to be diverse, but had no idea how to do that. I remember when I arrived, I was the diversity, right? And the journey there was full. It was over a decade of just experimenting and working things out and working things through and transformation for everybody, them, myself. And then eventually came to a space where it's a very diverse church. In that exploration, I was looking for spaces that could be Baptist in the classical sense, right? Where there's freedom, voice comes from the bottom. There's spaces for speaking, etc. And from that, I found Evergreen, and I really like how it was built, it was made, and how it was working out in various ways. So we brought some of that into the church space I was serving in. And then again, this Spirit, I got this email wondering if I would be interested in coming over and seeing, etc. And that's how I ended up here. So it's sort of this mutual exploration from a distance.
Right. Well, for me, in my journey, I've gone through a lot of different traditions. And I've been a part of Japanese Baptist Church. I was pastoring there for about 4 years. And then I came to work at the region, right, as the associate executive minister. But for me, my journey in the American Baptist Church started in Evergreen. And so anything I know about the American Baptist Church is through Evergreen, right? And so this was kind of interesting to me is that, and now that I'm on regional staff, now I'm starting to meet people outside of our region. And the first thing I discovered was, we are unusual, we do a lot of things that are different. We look at things differently. So I thought it'd be interesting for our listeners here to talk about what is Evergreen, and how might it be different than the other regions around us?
Yeah, how is it different?
It's a big it's a big thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is that it aims to give a voice to everyone, or as many as possible, by providing vehicles for people to express themselves from within who they are. Which is one of the things I like about it is that it offers a space for you to be who you are and express yourself on this radical equality that we don't see. For us, equality has nothing to do with number of churches or number of people or giving amounts. for us, equality is the presence of our diversity. And that alone makes it radically different than most other spaces. And so it could be, in some ways, it will feel unfair to some to say that a small group has equal representation as a very large group who will give considerably more. But for us, it feels like it's gospel driven. So the biggest differentiator for Evergreen is this structure that seeks to hear from our diversity, and our bylaws and organizational structure force us to make sure that we give a voice to everybody, which I like because it takes it away from personal choice. So it almost doesn't matter. I mean, whoever is leading could do a whole lot of things, right? But the system itself is being built in a way that keeps tugging away power from pooling in any specific place. Right. And that would be the second biggest thing in Evergreen. That by design, we're forced to keep from hoarding power in any specific place. Sometimes it happens, but is this tug away from it. And I think that is the radical difference, because as we see in our country, power is such a enamoring thing.
So that there's a lot of great stuff to unpack there. Tell us a bit more about like the organizational structure of Evergreen. Like you mentioned before, like that's very unique and that's very important for us to bring about equality and diversity. Tell us, like, what is this organizational structure? What does it look like?
The way Evergreen is organized is we're organized in ethnic caucuses. We have 4 ethnic caucuses. We have the Euro Caucus, the Black Caucus, Asian Caucus, and the Hispanic Caucus. And the idea there is, oftentimes when we encourage diversity, people say just focus on what you have in common, and let the rest go. But the way we feel about this is that there's importance in both. So the bulk of what we do is things that we have in common, being Christian, gathering, worshiping together, etc. But then we add these sprinkles of things that are truly from who we are as a culture or various expressions of that. So each of the caucuses have authority and an independent authority to decide who their leadership is and how they contribute. But beyond that, once those 4 caucuses then form the base of our structure. And then any governing group, any committee, any organization, anything like that, has to have representation from all of our diversity for everything we do. And most importantly, the task of choosing who that representation is falls to each of the caucuses themselves, right, including our executive committee, which is the board that oversees the region as a whole. That space has 2 representatives from each caucus, and each caucus chooses who those representatives are. I think that's remarkable. And most importantly, I have very little say about who they send to the executive committee. As you know, in CEO world, you want to stack your board so you could get things done. In our space, this radical equality exists there too, because they decide who comes up. It's a very Baptist thing. Right. So that's kind of a broad view of.
And it's interesting how you describe it. Like I think it's a very sincere Baptist approach, really recognizing the agency, the liberties of like each individual congregation. For me, like Evergreen sort of recovery of those things. I've been pastoring in East Asian American churches for 20 some years in different like Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, and being a part of different traditions where we are like the clear, ethnic minority of the denomination. I always had this approach, like I didn't want to get into denominational work because I knew at some point, everything that they're talking about at that level doesn't apply to me and I don't get a voice about it, So like, why bother, right? And that's what's so interesting for me when I joined Evergreen is like, no, actually, if I do participate, I do have a voice and I do matter. And that was like a game changer for me. That was, I had never really had that kind of interaction with the denomination. And so that was really powerful for me. And that I could finally be at the table where I wouldn't be worried about, like, am I going to get outvoted by an ethnic majority? But this caucus approach was like, no, we're going to wait for every voice. Every voice is equal. Every voice matters. And that's really powerful for me.
Yeah, it is. And even most importantly, right, we are not allowed to make choices unless every voice is in agreement.
Right.
There's no way for us to overpower others because everybody has, if we want to look at it in the negative sense, we'll say everybody has veto power.
Right.
But we rather look at it in the other way.
Yeah.
Everybody can help, can contribute to making whatever idea we have better, because when we arrive there, because everyone has contributed, we have this breadth of perspective that most other places would never have. And I think that helps us make wiser choices.
I like what you're saying, because sometimes when we talk about this, it sounds like we're just trying to sell Evergreen to everybody, right? Like, oh yeah, this is the best, everyone join this party. This is also hard, right? Oh. And it's very fraught with a lot of pitfalls, right? Like, I think we should be honest, like, as we're discussing this, like, this is difficult, this is hard. There's a lot of challenges and pitfalls to it. So maybe, I don't know if you want to share like some of the pitfalls that you've observed being the executive minister here.
Yeah, no, it is incredibly difficult to live in and lead in a diverse space, because one never arrives. We never say, okay, now we've made it. It's a constant building, a constant retraining, a constant thinking. And then even in language, we have to translate things. So we have to make sure that the translations convey the meaning of what we said in a way that is close to what we intend to project, right? That meetings, we have to be conscious of how people engage at meetings that is different in other spaces. We can't just expect people to express their opinion. Even at an executive meeting level, right? In some spaces, we will think, well, if you made it here, it's because you're going to speak out. That's your purpose, right? But speaking out, even that alone, speaking out in different cultures means different things and requires different paths. So all of that together is incredibly complex. So it is incredibly difficult, and it requires constant attention and work.
Yeah. And it really requires like a humility, right? Like we're just figuring this out as we go, right? Mm-hmm. We're learning as we go, we're growing as we go. And it requires like a lot of grace, I find.
It does. And for me, in my position, right, because we're so classically Baptist, in the sense that most people don't know now, right? Because generally our idea of Baptist comes from our sisters and brothers who are more hierarchical. But my role, rather than setting a path and making sure people go in that direction, my role is convening gatherings so we could discover a direction. And then I encourage in translation how we go, because that's better for the community. It's a very complex thing, but it's a more sustainable way to be Christians in this world, which fits right now incredibly. It's almost like we were designed for this season.
Yeah, this is what I really want to get into as well, is that, when we're talking about these words of like inclusion, right? We're talking about, everyone equal at the table. We're talking about diversity. This all sounds amazing, but also strangely foreign, right? Because like in our current culture, like American culture, we're just so conscious of divides right now, right? And inequalities, right? We're becoming more aware of like how systems are failing us in regards to justice. And so here's Evergreen, and we're talking about this, like it sounds kind of crazy, right? Yeah. But maybe not crazy, but possibly prophetic, right? Is it possible to say like maybe Evergreen, this humble region of the American Baptist denomination, might have something to say to the greater culture right now, right? So in your thoughts, because I like where you're going with this, is like maybe you could kind of highlight like what do you think Evergreen could bring to the greater cultural conversation right now?
Well, if we look at scripture, right, most prophetic voices come from the bottom and the outliers, right? Generally, the prophetic voices are outliers, and Evergreen is very much an outlier in a lot of categories. But what I like about what Evergreen is doing is we're choosing to follow and discover together, instead of we're setting up our reality and then we convert everyone to our reality, which is a lot of what happens in other spaces. You say, these are the parameters, and you need to, as long as you fit these spaces, we're going to do things together. What we're saying is, we're coming together, we need you to bring who you are, and together we could discover where Christ is taking us. Now that is radical because we're saying that diversity matters. Your differences matter, right? So I think one of the fears that people have, especially in the dominant culture, one of the fears that people have is that diversity means that you don't like who you are anymore. You have to reject who you are so that you could join this blandness, right? What we're saying rather is who you are matters incredibly. It's just that it doesn't matter more than who someone else is. And rather than being a negative thing, that's a positive thing. What this means then is that we have double, triple grown our ability to see exponentially because we have this broad perspective. So in essence, we're saying we need you who you are, you know? And so if you're in the Euro caucus, if you're white, we're not saying you have to be ashamed of who you are and ignore that to join us. What we're saying is be who you are. Just know that that doesn't mean that you're better than or for anybody else. And that's the radicals of that is that. And one thing I wanted to say is that Evergreen's diversity is also in thinking and outlook. This is not just an affinity group, which is what sometimes people are thinking where we should go because now everybody has chosen their camp and they want to stay there. So we're moving toward affinity group. People who think alike should be together. Evergreen is not that. We have a broad diversity of theology and we have a broad diversity of politics. But because of how we're constructing our world together, we have found ways to live in the same space. And I think that's remarkable.
Yeah, you know, I think what's interesting about Evergreen is that we're not here to rally around an issue or issues, right? It's like what brings us together, what rallies us is actually there is pathway, like there's a guideline. That's the common thing, right? We all have a common agreement that we're all going to come together. And that's what's interesting about it, right? Because I think you're right, like affinity groups, like they'll try and align with the latest causes or mission statements. But in doing it this way, because we rally around an approach, right, more than an issue, we're very flexible for what lies ahead, right? Like whatever issue it might be or not be. And to know that whatever we're going to do, we're going to hold this integrity coming together. I think that's really exciting for me. And I think to the other point that you said that I really like is, again, being like pastoring like minority churches for so long, a real concern in a lot of congregations is like, hey, if we join this diverse group, like does it, especially from my Asian perspective, I guess we're always taught like the only way you're going to fit in is if you constrict yourself or if you restrain or like change yourself to like fit into the mold. And it's kind of like disorienting at times, like when Evergreen settings is like, no, we want you to be fully yourself, like be as much as yourself as you can be, because that's what we need. Honestly, I haven't had that invitation much in my life growing up. So, you know, we're still learning, like, what does that look like? How do I do that? And we're all kind of learning. Some people might learn to like, oh, how do I learn to not be taking up all the space, right? Some are like, how do I learn to take up more space, right? And this is kind of like the grand experiment of Evergreen. And we've been around for how long now?
6 years.
Yeah.
Evergreen itself.
Yeah, Evergreen as a whole.
Over 20 years now.
Yeah, right. So it's been quite an evolution from even when it starts and even now. And so who's to say where it's going to go next, right?
Yeah, and at the same time, it's the entire time that Evergreen has been around has been an upward trend, right? Yes. It's just keeps growing.
Right.
That is a direct evidence of how relevant this type of creative space is. Right. You know, how we are craving it. And there are a lot of people who just don't think it could exist.
Right.
So, you know, people have been waiting for Evergreen to be dissolved into nothingness because of what we're trying to do, the entirety of our existence. And instead, the opposite is happening. And I find that, yet we stumble, there are mistakes, we assume we're going to offend somebody. We don't avoid that, but we say what's important is not those missteps, but what we do right after them, right? How do we recognize that we have misstepped, whether intentional or not, right? Sometimes we want to say, I don't have to say sorry because I didn't mean it. You know, what we're saying is that's especially when we need to say sorry, because we have to say, I didn't mean it because I didn't even see it. And, you know, so those conversations or sacred conversations are very important.
Yeah, and I've been studying a lot about innovation and ministry and design thinking, and there's this common thread about we have to quote unquote normalize failure. That we have to realize like this is a part of what we do. Like we just stumble and then we learn, right? The worst kind of thing is when you stumble and you don't learn anything because you just get up and you stumble in the same way. The key is not to stumble. The key is like after stumbling, what do you do, right? And that's what I kind of see about Evergreen that is like built into our DNA is that we're not afraid to stumble forward, right? Because when we get up, we're going to be just forward a bit more, like forward a couple more inches. And I love that. And that's why I'm excited about the role that I'm doing to help innovate and transform and renew churches is because it's very much in line with the core DNA of Evergreen. It's about how can we sort of stumble forward, right? How can we keep learning, humbly just learning from everything around us and seeing where God's leading us. And so I'm excited for the future. Maybe just to kind of wrap up this podcast, are there any things in your mind that you feel like, oh, this is something that's very interesting that is developing, or this might be something that we want to talk about next in the next season of Evergreen?
Well, your role, innovation and design, right? I think the problem with innovation is that we can't design it.
Right.
We can't say, this is how we're going to look like when we're innovated.
Right.
And churches especially, this is my own personal opinion, right? Churches tend to say, well, what's it going to look like once we get there,
right,
before they start?
Yes.
And what that does is that we just keep rebuilding what we are.
Right.
So when we're engaging with innovation in a creative way, it means, I think, literally that we don't know what it's going to look like.
Right.
Some of it we'll like, some of it we won't.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of the reasons. I think we might be the only region that has a full-time position at the executive level for innovating and designing ministry. We're gospel-rooted, profoundly.
Yeah.
So the idea is not how do we adjust to the world, but how do we translate the gospel to the world in a way they could understand now, and that's innovation.
Yeah. That's good. Oh man, so many good sound bites, so many good words in that. I just want to unpack that so much, but we got to save something for the other episodes, right? So I think we're going to just kind of pause and wrap up here. But I do want people to know that these podcasts are like ongoing conversations. You're going to see them in a lot of different formats throughout the internet. Be sure to look out for them. This is kind of a new beginning. One of the things that we were talking about as a regional staff was that there's a challenge because we're all like geographically scattered. How do we kind of come together to understand what Evergreen is about? Because we're so much more than just an institution, right? We're not an institution. Like we're sort of like a collective, like a movement. And how do you get connected with each other is very important. And so we want to make that centralizing space to be online. So you're going to see more content in the future, interviews, maybe teachings, things like that. So this is just the beginning. I'm really excited to go on this journey with you. I hope you stick around. And there's lots of space for lots of people, so come on in. It's going to be fun. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next episode.